object to it because it's absolutely god awful. We had a meeting down in Vineborough just over 2 weeks ago where with somewhere in the region of 90 people had attended, and it was a night not unlike this. And I started by saying to people that 100 years ago Britain was, food prices were going up, cost of fuel was going up, clothes were going up, and rents were constantly going up. It sounds familiar, doesn't it? Not a lot's changed in 100 years. But eventually they had to stop putting these rents up, and the reason was because the women in Glasgow, particularly in the Gorbals and Maryhill, all around that part of Glasgow, said, we're not having it. We're not having you landlords putting our money up when our fathers, our brothers, our sons are fighting the war. And eventually something like 32 unions in Glasgow agreed with them that this was not on, and they joined them. Had a huge march in Glasgow, George's Square, and the government had to give in eventually. The people won. 75 years on, they tried something similar with the poll tax. And I think all of us in this room are old enough really to remember what the poll tax was all about and the fight back with the poll tax. And although the Scottish Socialist Party wasn't around 100 years ago, we were during the poll tax, and we were one of the leading groups fighting the poll tax. And we did away with that. So the proof is there, people power works. If we get together and we resist it, we can stop this. Now, it's only got a week or so to go, so the chances are of it stopping is probably very slight, but it's possible. But we can bring an end to it if we all stick together. Richie will say about what's been going on all over Scotland. So before I finish, could I say that at the end of the evening, hopefully we'll be able to take a wee collection for you, because we need to pay for this room, and we don't have any millionaires in our party. Likewise, we've got a newspaper. I'm not sure if they're sitting at the moment. Sitting over here. These will be on sale as well, and this is a special edition on the bedroom tax. There's a lot of stuff in there in the bedroom tax. Can I also say that there'll be a protest meeting at the council chambers next Tuesday at 1 o'clock, where the cabinet are going to be discussing the motion that had gone before the council last week. We actually staged a protest at it. You may have seen it in the local paper, where there were two motions asking the council, first of all, to guarantee that no one would be evicted because they couldn't pay the bedroom tax, and secondly, to try and have bedrooms redesignated so as that if you were in a 3-bedroom house, maybe that third bedroom is somewhere for storing equipment for someone who is a disabled member of the family. So these two motions went before the council last week. They decided they couldn't make a decision. They sent it to the legal department. The legal department has advised the cabinet, and the cabinet will be discussing this on Tuesday. So that's an important day for us to have a protest there. So that will be 1 o'clock in front of Cunningham House. So if you can attend, it'd be great. And spread the word. The more people we can have there, the better. There's also a demo up in Glasgow on the 30th of March, Easter Saturday, that is, the day before Easter Sunday. Is that right? Easter Sundays, yeah. So likewise, if you can manage to get up to that, it would be great, because then you're going to feel the strength of numbers from all over the central belt. So having said that, I'll now hand you over to Richie. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Denise. Brothers and sisters, the purpose of the meeting called tonight by the Scottish Socialist Party, as I suppose, can be summed up as two main things. One is to end the meeting better informed, and the other is to be better organised against this vicious Tory tax as a result of the discussion we have. Because when the Tories took power with their lickspittle props, the Lib Dems, nearly 3 years ago, they told us all that we're all in it together. that there was a horrible economic mess and that the way to solve it was by cutting back on the welfare budget, cutting back on public expenditure, cutting back on what they call bureaucracy, which actually really means people's jobs, people's services, people's wage packet. And when they announced that we're all in it together, the laughter across Scotland and beyond was fairly deafening, because what they meant was that you've got the same interests as the bankers. You've got the same interests as the billionaires. You've got the same interests as the people that led the economy to the brink of collapse and then got a bailout to the tune of 1.3 trillion. That's 1,300 billion pounds of public money, which was used to bail out the bankers, the people that caused the mess in the first place. And when they bailed them out in 2008, and when they told us we had to pay the price, allegedly we're all in it together, because we're all equal after all. We're all in the same boat. The boat's sinking, so we have to bail it out. That's the message of George Osborne, of David Cameron, of Clegg and people like that. It's the message of the Cabinet. But pause for a minute and remember that that same Cabinet, out of 29 members at the last count, 23 of them are millionaires, some of them multi-millionaires. That's got very little in common with the millions of people who are struggling to survive, and survive on low pay, survive on even lower benefits, survive as profits rocket, and as the prices of things like fuel rockets, and things like the price of food rockets. All the cost of living that working class people have to endure is rocketing through the roof at the same time as wages, benefits, pay, income of all forms is going downwards. That's how much we're in it together. Working class people are being exploited to the hilt, and one of the main weapons they've got is fear. Fear of not being able to fight back. Fear of the unknown. Fear of the future that this system holds in front of us. But the other weapon that runs alongside this fear is the weapon of divide and conquer. Of dividing people, one from the other. Of dividing the unemployed from the employed. The sick and disabled from the rest of us. Dividing black from white. Dividing long-term residents from new incomers to the country that we live in. That kind of division is something that's part of the blood-stained history of the rulers of this country, actually, but it's something that you use day to day in a pernicious fashion. And actually the bedroom tax is a glaring and brutal example of those methods by the government and the rich that they represent, the rich that they are. Because they want to try and divide us. They want to try and defeat us by dividing us. And that's why it's important, even though the subject tonight is the bedroom tax, and that's what I'll concentrate on as well, it's important to set it in its context of the wider attacks that are taking place against working class people. For example, the fact that they're slaughtering jobs in tens of thousands, day by day, starting with the public sector, which then has the knock-on effect in the private sector. But because public sector workers are insecure in their jobs, have their pay cut, can't afford to spend as much, the knock-on effect is in the private sector also losing jobs and also losing pay as a result. And there's a threat of something in the region of 250,000 jobs being lost in the public sector, and the same amount again in the private sector if this Tory-led coalition has its way and gets away with it. And tomorrow there's a fight back taking place which should boost us all when it comes to fighting the bedroom tax. Because some of the very people that are expected to administer this pernicious attack on the lowest income families and households are taking strike action against the cuts by the Tory government. Civil service workers in the PCS trade union, 250,000 of them, are out on strike across the UK tomorrow, including about 30,000 in Scotland. And that should be a boost to our morale in fighting back against the government. Because the more fronts that they face, the better chance of defeating them. Which is why I think it's important to extend support to that group of workers when they take the action they are, on job losses, on pay cuts, on attacks on workers' rights, and so on. Because the bigger context of the bedroom tax, and the explanation for it, is fairly straightforward. On the very same day, on the 1st of April, April Fool's Day, when the Tories and Lib Dems obviously assume that we're all fools because we don't spot this link, on that same day, as well as introducing the bedroom tax, they introduce another change in taxation. But the difference is, that is a cut in tax, and it goes to people on the incomes above 150,000 a year, being reduced from 50p to 45p in the pound of tax on that high income bracket. And it means concretely that every millionaire in this country enjoys a wage rise, if you want to call it that, of £107,000 a year from April the 1st onwards. That is one of the reasons they're introducing this brutal attack on the incomes of the lowest income people through the bedroom tax. Because the bedroom tax itself is a brutal wealth transfusion from the poorest to the richest, from the neediest to the greediest. And that sums up the nature of the government and indeed the capitalist system that we're living under. Because what they're doing is trying to rob £2 billion of the poorest over the next 2 years in order to give £3 billion in tax cuts to the millionaires and their hangers-on in the slightly lower income bracket of 150,000 a year. That is the summation of the system that we have to fight, that we have to resist. Because what they've decided is that they need to cut the welfare benefit bill. So, for example, they've already assaulted the sick and disabled in an absolutely merciless fashion. They've demonised them. They've used expressions like making a distinction between the skivers and the strivers, the shirkers and the workers. And by the way, it's not just the Tories that have used that expression, it's New Labour as well. New Labour leaders have used exactly the same terminology of abuse towards people unable to work and trying to scrimp and save to eke out an existence on the low benefits that they get. Shame on them when they claim to represent working class people historically. Shame on them, they've abandoned the working class. And they try to divide us, to demonise the sick and the disabled. They use private companies like Atos, a French outfit that doesn't even hire doctors fully trained. They use the likes of students and sometimes maybe even nurses. And they decide whether you're fit for work. Whether you're fit for work. In fact, the place that people go in Glasgow is known as Cadogan Street to some people, but to most of us it's been rechristened Lourdes, because there's miracle cures that take place compared to when you go in and come out again. Because people who are literally dying of cancer have been declared fit for work and died a matter of weeks later. It's an absolute crime. It's inhumane, and it sums up the system we have to resist and that we want as the Scottish Socialist Party to replace root and branch. They're attacking the sick and the disabled already, but now they've come for a new form of attack. For example, they've introduced the cap on benefits of 1% increase maximum over the next 3 years in a row. Now, what they tried to do in the build-up to that was this divide and rule trick, the terminology of the shirkers and the workers, the skivers and the strivers. But they've got a problem in doing that, because actually 65% of the people that are facing a cut in their incomes because of those caps on benefit are actually in jobs. It's things like working tax credit, it's things like family tax credit, child benefits and so on. They're being capped at 1%. In other words, being cut when you compare it to the price of food, the price of fuel, the price of public transport, the price of living, the price of existence. That is the problem for them in their divide and rule trickery. Unfortunately, they get away with it on the television because the major parties are all agreed on the need to attack the poorest to give more money to the multimillionaires, Labour included. That's the criminal situation we face. And when the Tories and Lib Dems decided they want to introduce what we've all nicknamed the bedroom tax, they looked at the opposition in Westminster, across the benches. They saw the Labour worthies sitting on the benches and they thought to themselves, we haven't got a problem here. We can get this through without any real stiff resistance. That's one of the reasons they did that. And what they've brought in the bedroom tax is in some respects even more vicious than the poll tax of Maggie Thatcher in the past. And why do I say that? Because it's actually more divisive. It's consciously divisive. The one advantage for fighting the poll tax was the fact that it hammered virtually everybody, apart from the dukes and lords of society. It hammered the vast majority of the population, and there was therefore the greater opportunity to unite them in resistance through mass non-payment to bring down the poll tax and its architect, Maggie Thatcher. And many of us were veterans of that struggle in organising it. But when they brought in the bedroom tax, it's less people affected directly. The hope therefore they can get away with it by dividing us. But when I say less, it's certainly a large number. Across the whole of the UK, the government's own estimate is that 666,000 people are being hit by the bedroom tax. In Scotland, it's 105,000 people are being affected by the bedroom tax. And of those numbers, roughly 2/3 of them have a member of the household who is disabled. And they've also calculated that across Britain, of the 666,000 affected, at least 95,000 of them will literally be unable to pay it from day one. And obviously the proportion in Scotland is probably slightly higher even than that figure. Literally unable to pay. Not making a principled decision about whether it's justified. Not deciding that it's morally objectionable, even though it is. But literally having to choose between eating and paying the bedroom tax. What a choice. Because what it involves is saying that people who live on their own or live as a couple are only legally entitled to one bedroom if they're on housing benefit in the social sector of housing associations and council houses. One bedroom. Now that might not sound all that punitive when you've got a couple living together only having the one bedroom. But leaving aside the occasions when, for emotional reasons, they don't sleep in the same bedroom, more importantly, as far as I'm concerned, is the fact that there's umpteen cases of couples who literally cannot sleep in the same bedroom. And we've come across scores of them telling us their business at the street campaign stalls of the SSP in Irvine and all over Scotland, actually. People where one of the couple have such bad health that they literally cannot sleep in the same bedroom. But the Tory party, the party of compassion, where we're all in it together, make no allowance for that kind of situation. But of course the Tory party, they tell us, is the party of the family. So what happens if you're part of a family with children? Well, if the children are under 10, they're expected to share the same bedroom. I've got an 8-year-old, and he in recent months has already started talking on occasions about how he wants privacy. And that's part of maturing. It's part of growing up. But the party of the family make no allowance for that. They can be boy and girl, it doesn't matter. They're expected to share the bedroom up to the age of 10. And if they're teenagers, up to the age of 16, if they're of the same gender, they're expected to sleep in the same bedroom. Otherwise their parents are punished with the bedroom tax for the other bedroom. What a care and sharing society we have under capitalism, under Tory Lib Dem rule. It's abominable when you look at cases such as that. Or you get the disabled people. Like I said, 2/3 of those households affected, roughly speaking, have a disabled member of the family. And they make no allowance whatsoever for the fact that disabled people quite often need an extra room for things like medical equipment and changing whatever dressings and other things that they require, or for storage of the wheelchair or whatever it might be. They make no allowance for that. It's classified as a spare room, a taxable room, a source of income for the Tory government to give over to the millionaires in their tax cuts. That's the kind of society we live in today. The only way that the disabled are exempt, even though sometimes they need a member of the family to sleep over, even if they have a member of the family sleeping over with them 24/7, they are not exempt, because that is not classified as a recognised professional care. The only way they can be exempt is if they have a care service with recognised professionals, care workers, registered, staying in the so-called spare bedroom as part of the care duties that they require. That's the only form of exemption for the disabled. What a cruel, vicious attack on some of the most vulnerable sections of society by the rich, the powerful, the brutal, the ruling capitalist class that are represented in Parliament by the Tories and Lib Dems, and actually to some extent now also by New Labour. And of course, to tell working class families, educate yourself, get a good education and you'll have a future. Well, leaving aside the number of graduates working in minimum wage jobs, including people I work alongside, leaving that aside, when you are a student, if you don't live at least 2 weeks of the year in that family bedroom, it's taxed. That might not sound all that difficult, 2 weeks, but pause for this. When the universal credit comes in, which is a different form of attack on benefits, with a lump sum once a month, you apply for everything online, even if you don't have a computer, all of that, you're expected to budget and pay the rent out of the lump sum that you get, regardless of the problems you have of surviving and paying for food and shelter. When that comes in, it changes the rule about students in the bedroom, because then they have to spend a minimum of 6 months in the family home, otherwise the room is taxed under the bedroom tax. How the hell are they expected to study at university and spend 6 months of the year in their bedroom at the same time? That is a smoke screen, the current setup. And up until a week or so ago, it was also the case that when you get the adverts on television for more and more foster parents to volunteer, because of the crisis of care for children, the children that desperately need the love and care of a foster parent for all sorts of different reasons, then the reward for being a foster carer, a foster parent, included the fact that foster children were not classified as permanent residents under this legislation, and therefore the room would be taxed under the bedroom tax. Now, even that became too much for the Tories, and they decided that to appear to give some kind of a concession. So a week and a half ago, in the face of public uproar, they granted a concession on the foster parents. Likewise, the areas that are worst affected by the bedroom tax are the areas of multiple deprivation. Towns like this, housing schemes in Glasgow, in Dundee, in Edinburgh and so on, where working class kids are bombarded by recruitment material, including at their schools and career days and so on, by the armed forces, to recruit them, to then send them to the killing fields of Afghanistan, maybe in the future of places like Syria and God knows where else. If the imperialist monsters of America and Britain have their way, they'll drag these young kids out of the unemployment cesspits that they live in and throw them in, allegedly, to get a trade, and the trade becomes death, and sometimes their own death. That is the situation in reality facing working class families quite often, where the only choice is the army for their sons or sometimes their daughters. So what does the bedroom tax do about that? Up until last week, the Tories had issued the diktat that the room that those squaddies were coming back to on leave would be taxed under the bedroom tax. And that, again, along with the foster carers thing, caused such uproar that they've given that as a concession to the public outcry. But let's keep this in perspective. On the one hand, it means that protest, that anger, when organised and channelled, can actually win concessions out of this brutal government. But let's keep it in perspective, because actually only 5,000 people are affected by one of the measures and less than 5,000 by the other, by the foster carers and the army personnel. So less than 10,000 people, and that's not in Scotland, it's in the whole of Britain, are given concessions by the Tory government in their minor retreat last week. My attitude to it is they're slowly stepping backwards in the teeth of opposition. Don't stop, chase them to force them to scrap the bedroom tax, not to amend it, but to scrap it. That's the intention and the aim of the SSP, not to fiddle about with it and get this or that concession, this or that exemption, but to get it abolished outright as an abomination that attacks working class people at the And before going over some suggestions of the kind of things we can consider doing, let me add one qualification of what I've said about how horrible this tax is. Because there is a family actually that's well chuffed with it. The husband and wife are known as David and Priscilla. Now, if there's any David and Priscilla in this room, I apologise, it's not you I'm talking about. I can just tell that it's not you. David and Priscilla have 3 children. They're grown up, they've flown the nest, like many a parent's children. But instead of facing the agony of not having a room for those grown-up children to stay when they come and visit you, especially if they're further away, like many of us face, or even if you're of that age, when you've got grandchildren, of not allowing for a bedroom to be there available for the grandkids to stay and have a civilised, decent, loving environment in a kind of second home almost with their grandparents. That's what faces so many families in this town and in this country, but not for David and Priscilla, because they've got the luxury of having a 4-bedroom house, Highgate in London, and their bedroom is not the average one, their home is not the average one, it's valued at 1.9 million. So they're well enough off. On that level, you'd think they might be suffering bedroom tax on 3 bedrooms, since they've got 3 to spare. But it gets worse, because that's where they live, but only during the week. Because on a weekend and during the holidays they go somewhere else. They go to a place called Eastry Court. Now, it's not a cul-de-sac, it's not a crescent in a housing scheme. Eastry Court is in Kent, and it's one of the oldest country piles, one of the richest aged homes in the whole of Kent. And they don't have 3 spare bedrooms there, they've got 8 in total. So this couple have 11 spare bedrooms, and they don't pay a penny in bedroom tax, because they own both the houses, first of all, and secondly, because David, the husband, is the architect of the detail of the bedroom tax. His full name is Lord David Freud, grandson of Sigmund Freud, the psychoanalyst. And if you believe what they're doing is good, then you need your head examined, obviously. But psychoanalyst grandson David Freud is a Tory Minister for Welfare, and he started doing that in 2009. What was he doing before that? He was part of the Labour government. He's a millionaire, and his property is obviously worth a lot more than millions. That's the kind of people that are issuing the bedroom tax to those of us with 2 farthings to rub together, so to speak. So what do we do to defeat this brutal assault? As far as I'm concerned, first and foremost, there's people who will not have the money to pay the bedroom tax. People living, for example, on £71 of the likes of job seekers allowance, then being docked on average, the average country is £14 a week. It ranges from about £10 to £22 a week. Some of them, of course, a minority, suffer the 25% cut through the bedroom tax. That goes up to £22, £88 or so a month. How can people on £71 a week pay a tenner out of that towards the bedroom tax? It's an appalling suggestion, and it's something that quite often simply will not happen. And the attitude of the Scottish Socialist Party is this. It's not that we're telling people don't pay. It's we're recognising reality. They will not pay because they can't pay. And then the question arises, what happens to them? Now, there was a regulation introduced in Scotland last August about action prior to eviction notice. And it means that they have to negotiate with tenants prior to issuing an eviction notice. And it's got a plus and a minus side to it. At least it means that it's not eviction notice as the first resort. It means that they try to negotiate repayment arrangements of a couple of pounds a week or whatever that is assessed by the authorities. But that means, of course, that there's people already in the system who have gone as far as the sheriff courts, faced with the threat of eviction, and come to repayment arrangements. In fact, in 2010, 15,000 cases went to the sheriff courts. prior to the threat of eviction. 5,000 of those were decreed, as they called in law. In other words, they had to make arrangements to pay their rent debt or otherwise face a notice of eviction. Those 5,000 people, for a start off, I believe, if they're hammered by the bedroom tax as well, which a big majority of them probably will be some of the first in the queue to face the threat of eviction by the local council, by the local housing association, or whoever, the social sector landlord. Because they will not simply be able to keep up their repayment system that they've agreed under those arrangements. And on top of that, there's others who will join the queue of that threat. Because, for example, it's not uncommon for eviction procedures to start after a couple of £100 of rent arrears in Scotland right now. And it doesn't take very long, or a mathematician, to work out that it doesn't take very long for that amount of debt to rise when you simply cannot pay the bedroom tax out of 70 odd quid a week or whatever. And those people, at the minute in law, will face the prospect of being threatened with eviction. And before I come back to that point and what we're doing to try and stop it, let me add the point. Eviction is not even a sensible solution. It's absolutely inhumane. The human cost of it is something you cannot calculate. Of being turfed out on the street with nowhere to live. But it doesn't even make economic sense. Because if people living in a 2-bedroom house, when they're only allowed by these dictators in Westminster to have one, or in a 3-bedroom house, when the Tory dictators decide you're only entitled to 2, when they have 8, 10, 11 to spare. If you live in that situation, then it means if you're made homeless, the council has a legal duty to rehouse you. And where are they going to put them? In houses at least as big, if not bigger. Because it's been proven there's not enough smaller properties available for rent for people to put into. Leaving aside the fact, I think it's absolutely scandalous that people who have lived in their family home, it's not just bricks and mortar, it's a home, lived in their home for decades, sometimes as a result of the death of their partner, their husband or wife, they now have too many bedrooms according to the Tories, and therefore face the prospect of bedroom tax, ultimate eviction. That's not uncommon either. People heading down past the Scottish Socialist Party street stalls on their way to the council to try and seek a 1-bedroom house because their partner has died, and straight after the funeral, that's the next horrific task that they face because of this legislation. If that is the situation, then they have not got enough bedroom houses to make available. For example, in the case of Scotland, a figure came out in the last day or so, that there's something like, if I can find it, there's something like 53 or 58,000 people who would be expected to move into 78,000 people who would be expected to move into a one-bedroom house according to the bedroom tax law. Last year alone, there was 23,000 people in Scotland applied because they were homeless, and according to the Tory legislation would only be entitled to a 1-bedroom flat. So 23 plus 78 is over 100,000 people expected to be shunted into a 1-bedroom house. And how many 1-bedroom houses do they let on average in Scotland every year? 20,000. So unless they intend to shove 5 families into every house and cause even more overcrowding, how are they going to even tackle their own problem, their own measures? Eviction is costly to the human being. It also costs the taxpayer on average £24,000 for every eviction case. So it doesn't even make any economic sense. One of the factors behind this, I think, as well as cutting the welfare bill, as well as hammering the poorest to give more to the rich, as well as that, they're also probably designed the bedroom tax to shunt more people into private sector accommodation, to enrich the private landlords, all of whom pay higher rents, charge higher rents than the social sector housing. And if people can't get a 1-bedroom house in the social sector, how do we pay for the private sector renting accommodation they might be forced to move into. In fact, one figure won't bury you with them. In Glasgow, on average, it costs the taxpayer £63 a week to pay housing benefit for social sector housing. If those same numbers of people go into the private sector, it's £90 a week to the taxpayer. It makes no economic sense, as well as being utterly inhuman. And therefore, what do we do about this threat of evictions? It could happen in a few months' time for some people. It could begin to trigger it. Our attitude as a party is that we have to do everything to prevent anybody being evicted. There will be not one eviction in Scotland if we have anything to do with it. And there's two ways in which we're trying to tackle that. One is to build up networks in every community, including this one, in the same way as many of us built the anti-poll tax unions to prevent warrant sales and their equivalents in England, and building up a network of defence to come to the aid of those in need to prevent them being evicted from their family homes. And that's why being linked up together is so important to do that in the future if it happens. But the other immediate effort we're making, and trying to get everybody here in this room to take part in, is to pound the authorities with demands that they pledge there will be no evictions, to demand that the council outlaws evictions and says there will be none on the basis of the bedroom tax. And that's why, a month ago actually, time flies, 4 weeks ago, in the big meeting we had in the Vineborough Community Centre up the road, we organised a protest from that outside the full council meeting a week or two later to demand no evictions, scrap the bedroom tax and the council tax But we had that protest, we put the pressure on the councillors. There was a motion moved by Joe Cullinan to that effect from the Labour benches, and the SNP leadership of the council decided to remit it, to delay a decision, to seek legal advice. They're meeting next week. The council leadership was called the cabinet. That's why we are calling upon you to join a massive protest outside that meeting and demand that they get off the fence and land on the side of the people of this North Ayrshire area, to say there will be no evictions under the bedroom tax procedures. And think of the weight of people's minds, the weight of fear that would lift from hundreds at least in the local area, thousands maybe even, who are affected by the threat of eviction ultimately if they can't pay the bedroom tax. And we make the same demand of the Scottish Government. Make it clear there will be no evictions in Scotland. Now, so far they've refused to be clear-cut on that. So far, to their shame, they've dodged that issue. But they have at least written to social landlords and said, we ask you to take steps to try and find ways of avoiding evictions. That's it in plain language, the way they've written it. And I think we need to continue that pressure by having the protests at the likes of the council meeting, by going to the councillors' surgeries and saying, get off the fence, declare that evictions are outlawed in this area. And if enough councils do it, it'll make it unworkable for the Tory government to implement. And already, some have, at least partially. For example, Dundee City Council, a few days ago, declared precisely that for at least the next year, there'll be no evictions on their bedroom tax system. In Brighton, over a day or so ago, the Brighton Council down on the south coast of England have declared the same thing. And there's another aspect of what we think the council should do. They should creatively find ways of changing the names of rooms. Because the bedroom tax law of last year doesn't actually define what a bedroom is. Now, don't believe the myth, as far as I'm aware. I'm not a lawyer, but there's a myth spreading about that we even encountered on the street on the way in here, that if your room is 7 foot by 9, therefore it counts as a box room and doesn't classify as a bedroom. That is a myth. It's not true, unfortunately. It's not the case. My partner is a welfare rights officer, and the way she described it in a short phrase is that if the door opens outwards, it's a cupboard. If it opens inwards, it's a bedroom. And by the way, changing the hinges won't work either. It'll still define it as a bedroom. So we can't get round it that way. But the council has the power to decide what is classified as a bedroom. For example, that they allow for the disabled facilities in a house that are really needed, and so on. It wouldn't solve everything, but it would begin to eat into the numbers that are affected directly by this vicious bedroom tax and make it more and more unworkable, incapable of being implemented. And there's a council that already, in my old stomping ground of Merseyside where I used to live, Knowsley Council, outside Liverpool, has declared that they're redesignating all their housing stock to try and avoid people being charged the bedroom tax. In other words, they'll reclassify some of the rooms as something else and will not be classified as bedrooms. There's plenty of creative ways if there's the political will to do it. And that's where we need to pound the politicians from the two major parties in Scotland, Labour and SNP, into making those steps to prevent the bedroom tax being implemented where they're in control. I have to say as an aside that Labour and the SNP are extremely disappointing in the crude, cynical political games that they're playing. Because, for example, in the case of East Lothian Council, the SNP moved a motion that there should be no evictions and Labour defeated it. In North Ayrshire Council, Labour moved the motion and the SNP at least delayed it. In the case of Western Barton, it's even worse. The Scottish Socialist Party councillor Jim Bowen was the first actually to move a motion of that kind and demanded an emergency council meeting in Western Barton. The Labour council refused to even have such a meeting. They refused to have a meeting to discuss it as an emergency. And they said it'll be in plenty of time, 4 days before it's implemented. But they've got something coming to them in the form of a demonstration on that day that we and the trade unions in the area have organised to bombard them with the demand, no evictions, and redesignate the housing and introduce maximum payment of discretionary housing payments to people to cushion the blow and other things like that. Now I'll finish by saying this. There's measures that can be taken that soften the blow a little bit. Everybody, I think, should seek the advice of welfare rights officers who do their best to try and get, they're absolutely snowed under at the minute, totally stressed out of their minds with the workload, and they're being cut in number, and some of them are being downgraded in their jobs by housing association bosses on 100,000 plus a year who have decided that they're being paid too much at the very time when they've been hammered with demand for help from people desperate over the bedroom tax. That's a fact that I know. And it's disgraceful because the bedroom tax will not create a single job and it will not build a single house. Quite the contrary. It's an excuse for cuts by local authorities. It's an excuse for cuts by local housing associations, whether it's to their staff, their housing stock, their services. And in that sense, we're all affected, even if we don't have to pay the bedroom tax. Services will be cut when people are unable to pay the bedroom tax, and the council uses that as an opportunity for even further cutbacks. So there's measures that can be taken like that. I would also advise everybody to appeal against the decision. Fire in appeals to the local housing authority that covers you. Plug up the system as best you can with such appeals, because it's your legal right to do so and have your case examined. Try not to just cave in and accept it, because you do not stand alone. There's a growing army of opposition that we're helping to build across the country. But I'll finish by saying this. The bedroom tax is not something we want reformed. We want it abolished. And we do so on the basis, not of punishing people as something else, like Labour has said they want to do. In the last day or two, they have announced, for example, that they want to abolish, some of them have said they want to abolish the bedroom tax. A Labour Cabinet Minister, or Shadow Cabinet Minister could say, Helen Goodman, has said, we will keep the bedroom tax for people who refuse accommodation that they're offered. Suitable alternative, smaller accommodation. We'll use the bedroom tax there. That's how much they're serious about scrapping it. And they're also said that instead of the bedroom tax, which they say is unworkable, that what they want to bring in is to cut the benefits bill by getting people into jobs. And that's why Labour, to quote them, is calling for a tough but fair compulsory jobs guarantee. This would offer anyone out of work for more than 2 years a real job, one that they'd be required to take, no ifs, no buts. In other words, take any kind of job, no matter whether you're fit for it, with the help of ATOS, and if you don't, you'll have your benefits cut. We don't offer that form of cut instead of the bedroom tax. The Scottish Socialist Party is quite straightforward about this. There is no excuse for any of the cuts. There's no need for them. There's no financial reason for it. There's no economic case for it. Because the cuts to benefits, the cuts to pay, the cuts to jobs, the bedroom tax cuts, whichever you want to make, they're completely unjustified in a nation awash with wealth. A nation where also the rich get away with daylight robbery. A phrase that at least some people think was originally invented in relation to the window tax, where people bricked up their windows to avoid the window tax that William of Orange originally introduced, incidentally. But that window tax, which led to the phrase, some linguists think, of a daylight robbery. Daylight robbery today includes the fact that the richest and big business avoid £120,000 million in tax every year. 120 billion. Now what does that mean? It's mind-boggling as a figure for us. But in concrete terms it means, for instance, 4.8 million new jobs being created. Not on the minimum wage of today, but on 25,000 a year of a salary. 25,000 a year for almost 5 million people could be created and paid for by the one measure of getting that tax in of the rich tax dodgers. But it goes beyond that. We've got oil wealth, we've got the wealth of land, we've got the wealth of talent and of skills of people in this country. And if those things are married together by having public ownership of it and democratic control, not only could you scrap the bedroom tax, not only could you stop the attacks on the sick and the disabled and the pay cuts for workers in jobs, you could boost wages, you could build houses, you could create jobs by building houses, you could have houses fit for humans of whatever size you choose, of environmentally high standards to avoid pollution and cut fuel bills. You could do those things and create jobs and skills for young apprentices and so on. Give hope to a future generation. But to have that, you'd have to fight for a socialist society, for a social Scotland. That's what we're about. You don't have to subscribe to that to join the fight against the bedroom tax. But by Christ, it's a powerful alternative to that vicious assault on working class living standards. So join together, discuss the issues tonight, join together in opposition to the bedroom tax, but also, if you feel like it, join the Scottish Socialist Party and build a different future for ourselves with homes, jobs, decent incomes, increased benefits for the sick and disabled that cannot work, and for the pensioners who've retired, be given dignity in retirement instead of poverty and struggle. That's the kind of society we want instead of what's on offer. Join us in that fight.
Yes.